Welcome to the Unfeigned Faith Podcast, where our desire is to encourage each other to live out genuine Christianity in a superficial world. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Now here's our host, Pastor Aaron Richert.
Thank you for joining me on this special Independence Day podcast. And today I'm outside. I thought what better place to be than to be out what we traditionally do to celebrate Independence Day, out in nature and barbecues and by the lake. And so you might hear some background noise. People are playing, birds chirping. But I thought I'd bring it here today. But this weekend we're not celebrating 4th of July. We are celebrating our independence from tyranny. And that's important distinction. People keep saying, Happy 4th. No matter what country you're in, there's 4th of July. That's a date on the calendar. But we are celebrating something very important, something very special. It's amazing to me every year. It seems there's some folks that go down to the beach and ask random strangers, hey, what are you celebrating this weekend? And some will say Independence Day, but then they'll say independence from who? What was the war about? And it's amazing how few people know what this day is about and how special it is. But really, it's the anniversary, it's celebration of not when we were free, but when we declared our independence from Great Britain. And the famous document to kick it all off, the Declaration of Independence. And, I never read the Declaration of Independence growing up in school. I never read it till I was an adult. And even my whole time serving in the United States Army, I never read it. And it's a shame that it's not a common literature in our society, in our training and learning what it is to be an American. And so I thought I'd break it down a little bit. Go line by line and say, what is the Declaration of Independence all about? And so it starts off in the preamble, and I'm going to kind of read what it says and then kind of give sort of a modern day interpretation of it. It says, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. In other words, when people decide as a group to separate from one political process and create a new one, especially when their rights are being violated, it's their duty to fully explain why they're separating. And, the Declaration of Independence has been called the greatest breakup letter of all time. And that's exactly what it is. It's saying we are leaving, and here's why. In other words, it's not you, it's us, capital U, capital S, the U.S. And so he says, this is why. We're going to explain to you. First of all, and I'm going to kind of break it down to really three sections of a new theory of government. So it starts off, we hold these truths to be self-evident. In other words, obvious. It's not something you have to build a case for. It's self-evident that all men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator, capital C, with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So these are self-evident things, but by virtue of having a life, the self-evident thing is that you should be able to protect that life. It's a right. Liberty, that the fact that you are an autonomous life form, you should not have your liberty invaded and be subservient to another. And then, of course, the pursuit of happiness, getting in the way of what you feel to be the best decision for you, for your family, and so forth. And so when he says, first of all, they're endowed by the Creator, acknowledging there's a Creator, acknowledging there's a God, a higher power, and that's who we're appealing to, this higher power, that there are unalienable rights. I love the word unalienable. That means it cannot be separated. In other words, it cannot be taken by force or voluntarily. I can't willingly give up these rights, not truly, if they're from God. And so we believe that these people have these rights, and these rights come from God. One person said there's a foundation out there called Freedom from Religion Foundation, and they say nowhere in the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution does it mention God. And I said, boy, you are just not reading it. But the capital C Creator, that's exactly who they're talking about. So as we're talking about this new form of government, it starts with the people, not the government. The people having these rights. Secondly, that to secure these rights. So the point of securing them, governments are instituted among men. So what's the point of government? To secure the rights of the people, not the rights of the government, but the rights of the people. To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, to what ends? The ends of their basic rights, and securing them. It is the rights of the people to alter or abolish it. The government, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. I love the way it's written here. So we have these rights, recognize these rights come from God. To secure these rights, we need an authoritative body. Behind this body will be judicial. Behind this body will be maybe military, whatever it is. But that body is there for the very purpose of securing the rights of individuals, of people. And so what do? We put governments, we institute governments among men. And here's the awesome thing. They derive their power from the consent of the governed. When government begins governing without people's consent, that's why we say this phrase: we are a nation of the people, by the people, and for the people. Okay, that's the purpose of it, for the people, by the people, of the people. It's from within. It's a very important thing. So when we say, when we look at this, what's the purpose of government? It's to secure those rights we talked about, those inalienable rights, the ones that are given by our Creator. We have government with consent of the governed. We live in an age where everyone's really big on this word consent, right? Do you have consent, or are you going against someone's will? And what's amazing is how the same people that tend to talk about how important everyone is, consent, they're not looking for our consent when they rule us at times. And here's the amazing thing. When you talk about governmental leaders, they're actually not leaders at all. In America, the amazing thing is people, individuals are the sovereigns. We are the ones in control. We are the lords, to use the old terminology. We're the masters. And we send them there in an organized body, governments instituted among men, to secure, to protect, to defend these rights. So when we start looking at all these different programs and stuff, and how inflated, how huge government's gotten, what's happening is we've missed the purpose. What is government about? And so the second aspect of this new theory of government is the governments are there to secure these rights, and to rule with the consent, the power, with the consent of the governed. We give them permission. Thirdly, prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. And accordingly, all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the form to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. And we have some kids acting like animals behind me. So what it's saying there is that changing governments has been around for a long time. We often will change government forms, but it shouldn't just occur without good reasons. And the nature of people is that we deal with an unjust government. We'd rather deal with it. We'd rather put up with it than to change it, because let's face it, changing it takes a lot of work, takes a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, takes a lot of division, takes a lot of fighting. And so what ends up happening, and boy, we saw this the last couple of years dealing with this coronavirus pandemic. We see giving a lot of consent, a lot of leeway to overstepping bounds in these basic rights. And now there comes a point where you're pushed far enough, and that's the point that the colonists reached in 1776. They got pushed too far. And so it's not a light matter is what they're saying here to do this, but it is something that does happen from time to time. And we should do this in a way to secure future securities, because what ends up happening is that you have the tendency of eroding. There's a tendency for things to kind of just fall apart. And so we don't want to just fix it for this generation. We want to have a long-term effect. And you saw that a lot in the founders' writings. They would use the word posterity, their future generations. Even if it caused them something, they wanted to pass something on. And so that's the point. Why are we doing this? Here's the new theory of government, that we have certain rights from God that cannot be separated from man. We must put together a government for the sole purpose of protecting and securing those rights. And the governed should rule with the consent. The government, rather, should rule with the consent of the governed. And that when things get bad enough, it's important that we understand that there does come a time where we must overthrow, where we must either change or abolish. That is very important. Why? For future generations. And as we're looking through this, we have to kind of ask ourselves, are we there yet? How close are we getting to this? Because there's a lot of tension, there's a lot of pressure, and I think the issue ought not to be, are we happy? But are our rights being violated? What am I leaving behind for my children, for the next generation? And I'm not talking about money, but I'm talking about these liberties which allow us to be prosperous, which allow us to chase after happiness, to allow us to go after these things. And so next on the list, we have this indictment of the king. Now I'm just going to kind of summarize this just real quick, because it was very specific what they were going through. I would encourage you to go through and read this. But basically it starts off basically that they've tolerated the king long enough, and now it's time to leave the control, or to change the control of the king and establish a new government. And they said, before we do this, we need to explain why. Here's what we're doing. And so it kind of goes into this list of how several colonies at different times had submitted proposed laws directly to the king, which was required for the public good, and he would reject these laws. He would reject what they were trying to do. The colonies would pass laws by their local government, and they would be suspended until the king approved them. They weren't able to govern themselves. And so they were taxing the people, but the people weren't being able to be represented. Sound familiar? Taxation without representation. The king, they flat out said, is a tyrant, because he refused to allow new communities to form elective groups of people, denying them their traditional rights of representative government. That's a basic thing, and that was a basic British thing, the representative form of government. So in some situations, meeting sites were conducted far away, where public records were located to discourage colonists from meeting as a legislature. They were discouraging any kind of organization. And so the British government, they would come in, they would disband colonial government many times in retaliation to certain protests. You want to speak against the king, or you want to go this way, then we're going to disband your government. And so what happens, it causes chaos in a community. Well, who's in charge? Who's the leader? We need that kind of organization. So they would keep kind of just disrupting things. So then the colonists were forced to form their own forms of representative government. After the assemblies were dissolved by the king, they'd start over. And the rights to life, liberty, and property, they were endangered when people are not allowed to form governments to protect them. Again, what was the form of government? To secure the rights. All right. If that government can't secure the rights, then do you really have the rights? Do you have private property, for example? Do you have these things? And so that was a big part. So next, the king disallowed migration to the colonies. Also, the colonists strongly believed that all the unused land should be made available to anyone who can settle on them and make them productive. The great concept. They want to get government out of the way so they can expand, so they can prosper, they can grow in these things. Colonies were then denied the right to create their own judicial system. They were forced to depend on the royal courts. Well, this is where we get the idea in America, trial by our peers. They don't know what's going on across the pond. They don't know what's going on in the royal courts. And so we should have our own judicial system. The king had made judges dependent on them for their jobs and their salaries. So it makes sense that they would rule in favor of the crown. They would side that way. And so these are, again, we're listing the grievances that why they broke free. The king had established military courts and added customs officials without the approval of the colonists. We don't want you to rule over us this way, right? So the colonists didn't approve the close supervision of the military in America. They had a standing army. They had a martial law, and it violated just traditional rights, common law, natural law that they would appeal to. Having these militaries in there, and so and by the way, what was happening by the time the Civil War was in full fruition, not Civil War, sorry, the Revolutionary War was in full fruition, they were stocking up arms, and the crown got word of it, and they were coming for the guns, and that's why it was a big ordeal. And by the way, we secured our rights, we secured our freedoms from citizens with guns. And contrary to what Joe Biden was saying, the citizens had cannons. All right, and when they wrote the Second Amendment, they had in mind be able to protect against a standing military, to be armed just as good. And many of them wrote about this. What was the militia? What were these things? Many of the founders wrote about this, that they wanted the average citizen, the citizenry, to be able to take on an army. And which is really, it's really concerning when a president says, well, you're going to need F-16s, you're going to need nukes, bring it on almost. He didn't quite say it like that, but boy, those who were listening, patriots, heard that. What are we flexing our muscle now? Are we going to see whose guns are bigger? Because that's a very scary thing and a very concerning, very weighty thing. So they didn't like the fact they put the military over the people. The king has cooperated with Parliament to pass legislation that violates traditional English law. These guys were Englishmen. All the settlers, all the colonists were Englishmen. They were citizens and Englishmen, but they weren't given the same rights as a regular Englishman. This was a big problem. So the colonies, they didn't have representation in Parliament to argue the legislation. They were treated as another colony that Britain had conquered, and not as actual Englishmen. So the Intolerable Acts are a violation against English tradition and law, and this is one that they brought up. The government protected soldiers from crimes committed against the colonists, and so the soldiers who were there representing the crown had more freedoms and more rights than the people there that they were there to protect, so to speak, and they were violating their rights and committing crimes against them, and they weren't held accountable. Next, they began cutting off trade with other nations in the world, and so they weren't able to prosper in the area of merchants, trading in the ships and so forth. Colonists were taxed, again, without representation, without their consent, all right? Colonists were often placed before the military courts instead of civil courts. There was no jury. There was no jury of the peers. Colonists were sometimes sent to England for trial for crimes against the king's property. Direct reference to the Quebec Act that extended the boundaries of Quebec into Ohio Valley, preventing the expansion of the 13 colonies, stopping them from going westward. The act was also seen as a bribe to residents in Quebec, so they would not protest against the abolition of their colonial governments. The king had abolished colonial laws and legislatures and ignored traditional values and legal precedents. They reinforced to the Declaratory Act of 1766 that stated that British government had the right to rule the colonies in any way that they saw fit. They treated it like one of the colonies they had conquered. The king has declared that he will no longer consider protecting the lives, liberties, and property of the colonists. The king's troops had declared war on the colonists for the reasons listed. The king had hired gunmen, mercenaries to attack the people, and any American colonist who was captured by the British Navy were forced to fight in the British Navy against his own countrymen. And what wickedness! All right. He had encouraged both Indian and slave revolts against the colonists. They had asked the king numerous times. This is an important one. they'd asked the kings numerous times to come to terms with the colonists. Each time he answered them with more restrictions, more punishments. Sound familiar? So therefore, he is a tyrant. They accuse him of being a tyrant for not listening and caring for the people. This is very important, because this wasn't just one day they decided, oh, we don't like our king, but this was after numerous pleas, numerous appeals, and they tried to go through all the right channels. They tried to do it the right way, appealing to the authority and so forth. They said, we've tried to work with Parliament, asking that they repeat British representative law. They had also reminded them that they were British subjects. They were Englishmen. They had ignored their inherent rights as British subjects. Therefore, they said, basically, we are declaring ourselves independent from a government that does not protect our rights and freedoms. By the way, what other choice do you have when a government stops protecting you? We are just going to declare ourselves independent because you're not protecting us anyway. And so they said basically this: we will be their enemy in war, but we will hope to be friends in peace. And what a wonderful thing. That actually happened. And to this day, England, Great Britain, is one of our strongest allies, and that's so awesome. But at some point, there had to be a lot of bloodshed, and say we are declaring ourselves free. So we have the last little portion, which is the Declaration of Freedom, Independence, and even war. We therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world, by the way, capitalized, that's God, for the rectitude of our intentions, do, in the name and by the authority of the good people of the colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. Because of all these grievances, we are declaring ourselves free from Great Britain. That they are absolved from all allegiance to the British crown, and that all political connection between them and the states of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. We are no longer connected to the crown. We are going to be an independent nation. We'll do all the things that an independent nation will do. And for the support of this declaration, we affirm reliance on the protection of capital divine, capital providence, God. We mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. And then 56 of them signed the Declaration of Independence. What is the value of a name when it comes to such a statement like this? See, it wasn't enough for just to say, collectively, those here who are assembled have made this decision and put like the seal on it or something and then send it over. These colonists, these representatives, these 13 colonies, wrote their names down. You may have heard the famous statement when he said, gentlemen, I believe it was Ben Franklin, we must hang together or we will all hang separately. This was the highest act of treason against the most powerful nation in the world. But they had enough. They wanted to be free. In fact, they set out to America back in the 1600s for this purpose, to be free. Specifically religious freedom, but how it broke out into so many areas. So these people signed. What does it mean that they would pledge to themselves their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor? To kind of put some gravity to it and what this declaration meant, specifically for the individual signers, I want to go back in time a little bit and share a clip that Paul Harvey had gone through as he looked at the names that were written on the Declaration of Independence and what it actually cost them. You see, this wasn't just a flippant decision. This was something that was going to cost them dearly. But they had a vision greater than themselves. And what a lesson we can learn for today. We live for the here and now today. These people were living for their grandchildren, for their great-grandchildren, for you and me. for the garbage we see going on today. And I wonder how many of them would just be rolling in their grave, seeing what so many are doing to their country. But I want to share this with you, and thank you again for tuning in. And I hope this will be an encouragement to you as you consider the gravity of this document. By the way, I hope you learned something from the document that maybe you've never considered before. But I want you to listen to this and consider the gravity of the signers here.
Americans, the how and the why of our beloved republic are so much better known and understood than the who. The United States of America was born in 1776, but it was conceived 169 years before that. The earliest settlers had watered the New World with much sweat. They had built substantial holdings for themselves, for their families. And when the time came to separate themselves from a tyranny an ocean away, at best it meant starting all over again after the ravages of war. Researching what you're about to hear gave a whole new dimension to my reverence for our nation's first citizens. All others of the world's revolutions, before and since, were initiated by men who had nothing to lose. Nothing to lose. Our founders had everything to lose and nothing to gain, except one thing. Hello, Americans. I'm Paul Harvey. You remember the cherry tree fiction a long time after you have forgotten the more earth-shaking history-making episodes in the life of George Washington. You have misplaced in your memory the details of Ben Franklin's statesmanship, but you remember his flying a kite. Joyce Kilmer was a great military hero, but the only thing you personally recall about him is his poetic tribute to trees. Maybe of this current decade, that which will be remembered best will not be its wars and its moon rockets or its crumbling frontiers or the giants who lived and died. Maybe all that'll survive to linger in the day-by-day vocabulary of generations yet unborn may be the songs of a Memphis minstrel or the reincarnation of electric automobiles. But for any eve of the 4th of July, I, Paul Harvey, do herewith bequeath unto you something to remember. You may not be able to quote one line from the Declaration of Independence at this moment. Henceforth, you'll always be able to quote at least one line. It's in the last paragraph where you will recall when I remind you. It says, "We mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor." In the Pennsylvania State House that's now called Independence Hall in Philadelphia, the best men from each of the colonies sat down together. This was a very fortunate hour in our nation's history, one of those rare occasions in the lives of men when we had greatness to spare. These were men of means, well-educated. 24 were lawyers and jurists. 9 were farmers, owners of large plantations. On June 11, a committee sat down to draw up a Declaration of Independence. We were going to tell the British fatherland no more rule by redcoats. Below the dam of ruthless foreign rule, the stream of freedom was running shallow and muddy, and we were going to light a fuse to dynamite that dam. This pact, as Burke later put it, was a partnership between the living and the dead and the yet unborn. There was no bigotry, there was no demagoguery in this group. All had shared hardships. Jefferson finished a draft of the document in 17 days. Congress adopted it in July, and so much is familiar history. But now, King George III had denounced all rebels in America as traitors. Punishment for treason was hanging. The names now so familiar to you from the several signatures on that Declaration of Independence, the names were kept secret for 6 months, for each knew the full meaning of that magnificent last paragraph in which his signature pledged his life, his fortune, and his sacred honor. 56 men placed their names beneath that pledge. 56 men knew when they signed that they were risking everything. They knew if they won this fight, the best they could expect would be years of hardship in a struggling nation. And if they lost, they'd face a hangman's rope. But they signed the pledge. And here is the documented fate of that gallant 56. Carter Braxton of Virginia, wealthy planter, trader, saw his ships swept from the seas. To pay his debts, he lost his home and all of his properties and died in rags. Thomas Lynch Jr., who signed that pledge, was a third-generation rice grower, aristocrat, large plantation owner. After he signed, his health failed. His wife and he set out for France to regain his failing health. Their ship never got to France, was never heard from again. Thomas McKean of Delaware was so harassed by the enemy that he was forced to move his family 5 times in 5 months. He served in Congress without pay, his family in poverty and in hiding. Vandals looted the properties of Ellery and Clymer and Hall and Gwinnett and Walton and Hayward and Rutledge and Middleton. Thomas Nelson Jr. of Virginia raised $2 million on his own signature to provision our allies, the French fleet. After the war, he personally paid back the loans, wiped out his entire estate, and he was never reimbursed by his government. In the final battle for Yorktown, he, Nelson, urged General Washington to fire on his, Nelson's, own home, which was occupied by Cornwallis. It was destroyed. Thomas Nelson Jr. had pledged his life, his fortune, and his sacred honor. The Hessians seized the home of Francis Hopkinson of New Jersey. Francis Lewis had his home and everything destroyed, his wife imprisoned. She died within a few months. Richard Stockton, who signed that declaration, was captured, mistreated, his health broken to the extent that he died at 51. His estate was pillaged. Thomas Hayward Jr. was captured when Charleston fell. John Hart was driven from his wife's bedside while she was dying. Their 13 children fled in all directions for their lives. His fields and grist mill were laid waste. For more than a year he lived in forests and caves and returned home after the war to find his wife dead, his children gone, his properties gone, and he died a few weeks later of exhaustion and a broken heart. Lewis Morris saw his land destroyed, his family scattered. Philip Livingston died within a few months from the hardships of the war. John Hancock, history remembers best due to a quirk of fate rather than anything he stood for. That great sweeping signature attesting to his vanity towers over the others. One of the wealthiest men in New England. And yet he stood outside Boston one terrible night of the war. And he said, "Burn Boston, though it makes John Hancock a beggar, if the public good requires it." So he, too, lived up to the pledge. Of the 56, few were long to survive. 5 were captured by the British and tortured before they died. 12 had their homes from Rhode Island to Charleston sacked, looted, occupied by the enemy, or burned. 2 lost their sons in the Army. 1 had 2 sons captured. 9 of the 56 died in the war from its hardships or from its more merciful bullets. I don't know what impression you had of the men who met that summer in Philadelphia. But I think it's important that we remember this about them. They were not poor men. They were not wild-eyed pirates. These were men of means. They were rich men, most of them, and had enjoyed much ease and luxury in their personal living. Not hungry men, certainly not terrorists, not irresponsible malcontents, not fanatical incendiaries. These men were prosperous men, wealthy landowners. They were substantially secure in their prosperity. They had everything to lose. But they considered liberty, and this is as much as I shall say of it. They had learned that liberty is so much more important than security, that they pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. And they fulfilled their pledge. They paid the price, and freedom was born.
We hope this episode was a blessing to you. If you have any questions, comments, topic suggestions, or even disagreements, Aaron would love to hear from you. Please feel free to contact him at www.unfeigned.life. Thank you for taking the time to listen. And remember 1 Timothy 1:5. Now the end of the commandment is charity out of a pure heart, and of a good conscience, and of faith unfeigned. Until next time, keep your faith real to the glory of God.